Byford Dolphin is easy. One moment, 4 men are alive inside a decompression chamber, breathing pressurized air, waiting for a routine procedure to complete. The next moment, a diving tender accidentally opens a hatch that was never meant to be opened under pressure, and in a fraction of a second, the laws of physics rewrite the definition of human death in the most catastrophic and scientifically documented way in the history of deep-sea diving. The year is 1983, November 5th, the North Sea off the coast of Norway. A semi-submersible drilling platform called the Byford Dolphin sits on the water, its decompression chambers housing 4 saturation divers who have just completed a week of work at the bottom of the sea. What happens next is not just a tragedy, it is a physics lesson written in human flesh. It is an event so violent, so instantaneous, and so thoroughly documented that it became required reading in aerospace medicine, forensic pathology, and decompression science. Engineers studied it. Doctors wrote papers about it. Physicists used it to illustrate the raw, destructive power of pressure differentials. And for decades after, divers who learned about it never forgot it. This is the story of the Byford Dolphin disaster, the most scientifically significant and viscerally disturbing occupational accident in the history of underwater work, and how 4 men died in a way that the human mind struggles to fully comprehend. To understand what happened on the Byford Dolphin, you must first understand saturation diving, because it is one of the most extreme occupational environments that human beings have ever voluntarily entered. The ocean floor at serious working depths, the kind of depths where oil platforms need maintenance and pipelines need repair, exists under crushing pressure that would kill an unprotected human being instantly. For every 10 meters of depth underwater, pressure increases by roughly 1 additional atmosphere. At 100 meters depth, a diver is experiencing pressure approximately 10 times greater than at the surface. This pressure creates an immediate and life-threatening problem for human physiology. Nitrogen and other gases in a diver's breathing mixture dissolve into the bloodstream and body tissues under high pressure. If a diver ascends too quickly, those dissolved gases come out of solution as bubbles, the same way carbonation explodes from a shaken bottle of soda when the cap is removed. Those bubbles form inside joints, inside the spinal cord, inside the brain, inside the heart. This condition is called decompression sickness, and it causes paralysis, strokes, heart attacks, and death. The bends, as it is colloquially known, has killed and crippled thousands of divers throughout history. Saturation diving was developed to solve this problem through a different kind of logic. Instead of sending divers down and bringing them back up repeatedly, each ascent requiring hours of careful decompression, saturation diving keeps divers at the same pressure as their working depth for days or weeks at a time. The divers live inside pressurized chambers on the surface of the platform, their bodies already saturated with dissolved gases at working pressure. They sleep, eat, and exist in this pressurized environment, traveling to and from the worksite in a diving bell that connects to the chamber system. Because they maintain constant pressure throughout their working period, they only need to decompress once, at the very end of their work rotation, and that single decompression is managed slowly and carefully over many days. Saturation diving is extraordinarily effective for deep water work, but it creates an environment of extreme vulnerability. The divers inside those chambers are entirely dependent on the integrity of the system around them. They are, in the most literal sense, living inside a pressurized container that can become a death trap if anything goes wrong with its mechanical operation. The 4 divers aboard the Byford Dolphin on November 5, 1983, were experienced professionals doing a job they had done many times before. Their names were Bjorn Giver Bergstrom, Truls Hellevik, Edwin Coward, and Roy Lucas. They had spent the past week working at a depth of approximately 120 meters in the North Sea, maintaining equipment on the ocean floor in conditions that would be impossible for any ordinary human being to survive. They were completing their working rotation and preparing to begin the long process of decompression, the carefully managed multi-day procedure that would gradually return their bodies to surface pressure. The diving bell had been brought back up to the platform and was in the process of being disconnected from the chamber system in a standard procedure that the crew performed routinely. 2 additional divers, William Crammond and Martin Saunders, were tending to the diving bell on the outside of the chamber system as part of this disconnection process. What happened next was the result of a procedural failure so simple and so catastrophic that it has haunted the offshore diving industry ever since. In the pressurized chamber system, there was a specific sequence of steps that had to be followed during the disconnection of the diving bell from the living chamber. Critically, a pressurization clamp had to remain in place and a specific hatch had to remain sealed until the pressures on both sides of the connection were equalized. If the hatch was opened while one side was still at high pressure and the other side was at surface atmospheric pressure, the result would be an explosive decompression, an instantaneous pressure equalization of catastrophic violence. The diving tender, William Crammond, opened the hatch prematurely. Exactly why this happened has never been fully established. Whether it was confusion about the procedure, miscommunication between crew members, a misunderstanding about which stage of the disconnection had been completed, or some other factor, the investigation could not determine with absolute certainty. What is certain is that when Crammond opened that hatch, the pressure inside the chamber was 9 atmospheres. The pressure outside was 1 atmosphere. The differential was 8 atmospheres, roughly equivalent to 117 pounds per square inch of force, released instantaneously through a hatch opening. The physics of what followed are precise and documented. The explosive decompression created a pressure wave of almost incomprehensible violence. William Crammond, who was standing immediately adjacent to the hatch when it opened, was killed instantly by the pressure wave itself. He was found some distance away from the chamber. The 4 men inside the pressurized section of the chamber, Bergstrom, Hellevick, Coward, and Lucas, experienced something that has no real parallel in human experience outside of the most extreme laboratory accidents. At the moment of decompression, the pressure surrounding their bodies dropped from 9 atmospheres to 1 atmosphere in a fraction of a second. The dissolved gases in every cell of their bodies, gases that had been safely held in solution by the ambient pressure, came out of solution simultaneously and instantaneously throughout every tissue in their bodies. This is not the bends as divers normally experience it, the gradual bubble formation that causes joint pain and paralysis. This was something categorically different and vastly more violent. The gases in their blood, their organs, their nervous systems, their bones, everywhere, expanded explosively at the same moment. The human body, in the most clinical terms available to describe it, was destroyed from the inside simultaneously throughout every tissue. The forensic investigation that followed was one of the most disturbing in Norwegian maritime history. The pathology reports, which became significant documents in the study of explosive decompression, described injuries consistent with instantaneous and total physiological destruction. The internal damage was absolute. One of the victims, Truls Hellevick, who was closest to the open hatch and therefore experienced the most direct effect of the pressure wave in addition to the decompression, was found outside the chamber. The force of the escaping pressurized atmosphere had ejected him through the hatch opening, a detail that required the investigators to confront the raw physical power involved in the event. The other 3 men were found inside. The 5th man involved, Martin Saunders, who had been working alongside Crammond on the exterior of the chamber, survived but sustained serious injuries from the pressure wave and the physical chaos of the event. He was the only survivor among those in immediate proximity to the failure point. What has made the Byford Dolphin disaster so persistently discussed in both scientific and popular contexts is the specific nature of the deaths involved and what they reveal about human physiology under extreme conditions. The phrase most commonly associated with this disaster in online discussions is the claim that explosive decompression of this severity represents the most painless form of death imaginable because the neurological processes required to register pain simply cannot function when the nervous system is destroyed instantaneously. This framing is technically defensible from a neuroscience perspective. Pain requires functioning nerve cells to transmit signals to a functioning brain for interpretation. When the entire system is destroyed simultaneously, the mechanism for experiencing pain no longer exists. The death, in the neurological sense, precedes any possibility of suffering by virtue of its own totality and speed. Medical and forensic experts who have studied the case have generally agreed that consciousness would have been extinguished in milliseconds, a time frame so short it cannot be meaningfully distinguished from instantaneous. In that specific and clinical sense, the characterization has merit. But the horror of the Byford Dolphin disaster has never resided in the suffering of the victims. The horror resides in the violence done to the human form itself, the visual and physical reality of what explosive decompression at this scale actually produces, which is why the forensic reports generated by the investigation are among the most disturbing documents in occupational safety literature, and why those who have read them in full rarely discuss the clinical details in casual conversation. The gap between the technical description of painless instantaneous death and the physical reality of what that death looks like represents a kind of cognitive dissonance that the human mind finds deeply unsettling. The official investigation by Norwegian authorities examined the circumstances of the accident in detail and reached conclusions that reshaped offshore diving safety regulations across the industry. The investigation found that the accident resulted from a failure in the procedural safeguards that were supposed to govern the disconnection of the diving bell from the chamber system. The specific question of individual responsibility was addressed, but the broader finding was systemic. The procedures in place did not provide sufficient protection against human error at a critical moment, and the design of the system itself did not include sufficient physical barriers to prevent this type of accident even if an error was made. In other words, the system had been designed in a way that allowed a single human mistake to have catastrophic consequences, without any redundant safeguard to interrupt the chain of causation. This finding led to significant changes in saturation diving protocols and chamber system design throughout the North Sea oil industry and beyond. New requirements for physical interlocks that would make premature hatch opening mechanically impossible under pressure became standard. The Byford Dolphin disaster effectively wrote new chapters in the regulatory framework governing one of the world's most dangerous professions. The 5 men who died, Cramond, Bergstrom, Hellevik, Coward, and Lucas, were professional divers in an industry that has always demanded acceptance of significant personal risk. Saturation diving in the North Sea in the 1980s was genuinely dangerous work conducted in genuinely hostile conditions by people who understood the risks better than almost anyone outside the profession. They were not ignorant of the environment they worked in. They were skilled specialists performing necessary work that kept the energy infrastructure of the modern world functioning. The tragedy of the Byford Dolphin is not the tragedy of ignorance or recklessness. It is the tragedy of a system that failed the people who trusted it, of a procedural gap that should have been closed before it was discovered in the worst possible way, of the eternal and humbling reality that human beings operating at the absolute edges of what the human body can endure are dependent on every layer of the safety system around them functioning exactly as designed. When one layer fails, when one hatch opens at the wrong moment, the margin between life and death in the deep sea environment is measured not in minutes, but in fractions of a second. The Byford Dolphin disaster endures in memory and in scientific literature because it illuminates that margin with absolute and terrible clarity, because it shows precisely what happens when the ocean's pressure, held at bay by technology and procedure and human care, is suddenly and completely released, and because the 5 men who died that November night in the North Sea deserved a system that never gave that margin a chance to disappear.